If it was easy, it would have been done. I mean, to a large extent, natural disasters and terrorist attacks are the chief challenges of our time. And that's those moments when they occur, that's when leadership matters. And that's what the gentlemen on stage here today really have epitomized. Beginning with Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper, who's had a biblical onslaught of floods and fires over the last 18 months. Thank you for joining us, sir. William McNulty, former Marine and co-founder and vice president of Team Rubicon, which is a group that sends vets into harm's way to help clean up after disasters. And General Honoré, who the whole nation knew after Katrina as the man who came in and helped restore order in a chaotic situation. It's an honor to have you all here. Now, Governor, let's begin with you, just to give us an update on the status of those devastating floods in your state, which I understand it's almost $500 million worth of damage at this point on infrastructure, and the human cost even more.
Well, I think we're well over $1 billion if you put the roads in with the housing. And to my knowledge, the first time the National Weather Service ever used the phrase biblical rains. I think the remarkable thing, and when those first days we flew over the canyons and down over the Platte River, and we saw all the destruction of roads, and not just the asphalt, but the whole road bed completely gone, bridges broken. And yet, when we get on the ground, we'd see people coming together and trying to help each other. And maybe the roads and bridges were broken, but the spirits were unbroken. And it really was a sense that it gave momentum. And we opened a road a couple days ago up what's called Boulder Canyon, out of Boulder, that people thought would take weeks longer to get open. And we've got, our Department of Transportation and Army Corps of Engineers, we've got the National Guard and active military service from Fort Carson working day and night to get these roads open, get people into shelter. It's been pretty inspiring just how hard people have put themselves to it.
And it's still ongoing, of course.
Oh no, we've got a long way to go.
And William, Team Rubicon has been there in Colorado trying to help the recovery. It's the essence of the first responders. You go, you run towards the fire, you run towards the flood. Tell us what you're doing in Colorado with Team Rubicon right now.
So right now in Colorado, Team Rubicon is doing mucking and gutting operations. So there's many homes that were not in the floodplain. It's just when the flash flood came down from the mountains, it happened to hit the homes on the way down. And so these people don't have insurance. And if they're going to pay a for-profit company that's up to $20,000, that they're going to have to come out of their pocket. And we do it for free. So we go into those basements, we get dirty. We take all that muck and gut out of those basements and bring some semblance of order back to these people's lives.
And tell me, why, in your estimation, do veterans make the best disaster relief?
Well, it's really interesting because, a lot of things that we see in disaster zones are actually very similar to what we saw in combat zones. And, unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells, unstable populations, limited resources. And veterans just happen to be really good in this type of scenarios.
General, let me ask you this, I think the key question, which is after Katrina, to some extent after 9/11, whether it's floods in Colorado or Hurricane Sandy in the tri-state area, has our culture of preparedness improved, or are we still lagging behind where we need to be as a country?
Well, I think we spend about $60 billion a year in the Department of Homeland Security. Part of that goes into FEMA. So our government has done a great job. We've rewritten some laws, but what has not changed much is the reaction of the people in this audience. Gallup shows, as well as FEMA polls show, only 15% of Americans have spent any time on preparedness. How many of you have 5 days supply of food and water? How many of you have a weather radio? Look at the hands, John.
Yeah, we got around maybe 20% if I'm being generous. All right.
And some of them lying. That's being generous. That's the problem we have. We spend more time getting ready for football games than we do for known disasters. This is one of the most, not dangerous, but vulnerable cities in America.
Washington, D.C.
Right, and we still don't have people prepared. You close the interstate and you tell people they have to shelter at home, like we did a couple of times in the big snowstorm, and you've got a major problem, and our nation's capital is not prepared. We need to work on that because government isn't good enough. Because on any given day, Mother Nature can break anything built by man. And if you can handle it, it's probably not a disaster, it's an inconvenience. When a mayor say he got it or a governor say he has it, it's a disaster to the people who've lost their homes. But major operation will require multiple levels of government, as include volunteers like Rubicon, and volunteers play a big effect. How do you get people from stopping the volunteers from coming in who said, hey, we can't let you in right now, it's a safety issue? Volunteers save more people's lives than any responders.
Well, let me ask you about Washington and his example. Right now, I mean, you represent local leadership. You were brought in to help deal with local leadership and a vacuum of leadership in the immediate aftermath of Katrina. But right now, Washington is so divided. Not only do we have a government shutdown, which could impact disaster relief, but in the most recent case of Superstorm Sandy, disaster relief itself was politicized. When you see that this side of Katrina, what's your reaction when you look at that kind of dysfunction?
Well, I hope the media will catch on and start doing some investigation what's going on with disaster reporting, hurricane reporting, and recovery, because not all of it is clean. You know, Sandy came in as a superstorm, yet after we declared it a superstorm and took it from being a hurricane, they still had 90-mile-an-hour winds. One got to say, how did that happen? Well, the reason it happened is insurance adjustment rates are lower if it's a superstorm than if it's a hurricane. And the audience ought to say, ooh.
Can I get a woo? Yeah?
We've got to fix that, ladies and gentlemen. The only thing going to fix that is people like you. This democracy works best when we have transparency. And we don't have transparencies on disaster, either on preparedness or on recovery. Because the people who need the recovery work the most, the poor, the elderly, and the disabled, will be disenfranchised in the recovery as opposed to enabled. The other part of it that's underreported is reporters spend too much time worried about looting and not enough time to say, well, why wasn't the gas and electricity turned off before the surge came? Why do we continue to build inside riverbeds that turns into flood? And why are local building codes not being adjusted to keep people from building inside a flood zone? Because Mother Nature, if it's a valley, it's created by Mother Nature by running water through it. If you build in it, what's going to happen? It's going to flood. Duh.
So, see, this is why the guy gave the nation such confidence in those moments. Straight talk, a little bit more of it we could use. Governor, you know, first of all, what the general's saying, that's got a ring of truth to it. Every journalist knows you follow the money, but you began as a local leader. You began as a mayor of Denver. Mayors usually got no place to hide. Now you're a governor, and you're dealing with disaster relief. How do things like insurance, FEMA caps, which are $35,000 lifetime, how does that make your life more difficult? How does the shutdown make your recovery more difficult in Colorado?
Well, certainly the challenges we face, and when you get a flood like we had in Colorado, which they're estimating in parts is a 250-year flood, once in 250 years, and it actually cut the channel so the river went in a whole new place. It was beyond the floodplain. It was creating a new floodplain, and these folks never dreamed no one ever told them they were in a floodplain of any sort. So of course they didn't have insurance, and yet FEMA does have these limits. So I think what part of the challenge is making sure people recognize they're not going to be 100% whole, right? Our job is to raise philanthropic dollars, take the FEMA money, do everything we can to let these people get back in the ring, get back in their fights, you know, lift themselves up and build their lives. And we're not going to be able to get everywhere just because there are these limits. And certainly the one thing we've seen, even with the shutdown, and FEMA is a different FEMA today than it was for Katrina. I've never seen a more transformational. I mean, they had 100 people on the ground by Saturday. The major flooding started late Wednesday night, all day Thursday. FEMA had 100 people there by Saturday, and they are all about helping, and they are action-oriented, outcome-oriented. They've been incredible. But even beyond that, now they're still working, but all their folks in Washington trying to process the paperwork, which is somewhat extended paperwork, I can say, is now there's no support. And we have issues. We had 20 million gallons of raw sewage that escaped in our various streams and rivers. So we have elevated E. coli all over the place on the grass of parklands. At the same time, we don't have enough shelter. So we've got people that are doubled and tripled up in trailers. And so they're pushing their kids out onto that same parkland. It's just a matter of time till kids get sick. And yet we can't get the EPA to do the testing to find out where the elevated E. coli is exactly because they're shut down. So there are some very real I mean, FEMA's out there working as hard as they can, and almost got carried away there and used an inappropriate phrase. But
You're among friends. Say it.
I won't be if I say something like that. FEMA is out there doing everything they can, I mean, every single day, but the shutdown has certainly dramatically affected, I mean, between HUD and EPA and a number of different agencies, it has limited, it's certainly slowed down and put at risk people that are going through the most difficult time of their lives, without question.
So the shutdowns actually compounded that human cost.
Absolutely, and I think there's, you know, certainly I never got in public service until I was 50. But in the private sector, you always have compromises, and somehow part of that is being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes when you're negotiating, trying to figure out, you know, extending a budget or reducing a budget. That's how you get to a compromise. Somehow Washington has lost that ability for empathy, the ability to see things from the other person's point of view, and now all of a sudden they're drawing deep lines in the sand, and the people who are held hostage by this are the folks who are most at risk. These folks who've just gone through, in so many cases, the worst experience of their lives.
William, in many ways, the counterpoint to what we see in Congress is our military veterans, is our service members. And the fact that you at Team Rubicon, the whole mission is to take those vets and to put them in nonprofit disaster relief, it highlights the point what we're hearing from the General and the Governor, which is that volunteerism is actually the most effective way. You can't just depend on the government. Government's necessary, but volunteerism is essential. What do you see when you talk to your guys on the ground there about the transformational effect they have, what they get back from the communities they're helping? What keeps you and those vets in the game, in the mud, digging people out day after day?
Sure. Well, I'm an enlisted Marine, so I might swear as well, and pardon me if I do. But what veterans lose when they take off the uniform are, we've identified three things. It's purpose or mission, community, and sense of self or identity. And it's those three things that we're giving them back through disaster response. So once again, they're able to dedicate themselves to something larger than themselves. And that's really what, veterans, the one thing that is different about today's military and this long war, America's longest war that we've been in, is that everyone who joined to serve did so voluntarily. They were not drafted. They were not told they had to do it. And that's actually a big difference between today's long war and previous wars. So it's purpose, identity, and community that we're giving back.
And does that inspire the folks on the ground? I mean, are the people you help, the families you help, do you see lives change and young people inspired to maybe join the service because of the way you help their families?
Well, I definitely think, our slogan is Bridge the Gap, and I think that one of the things we're doing is we're bridging the gap between an American public who has not been asked to share in the sacrifice of sending men and women to war, so they really don't understand the experiences that we've had. And so sending veterans out into these communities to do disaster response amongst the, this American public who has been really by and large indifferent to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has helped to bridge a lot of understanding between veterans and civilians and vice versa.
General, speaking of bridging the gap, let's talk about the impact of poverty on making these recovery efforts more difficult.
Yeah, and Hurricane Katrina was the size of the country of England, about $114 billion in destruction, over 1,800 people dead. The majority of the remains are dead people we recovered after Katrina came from a population I like to refer to as a vulnerable population, the elderly, the disabled, and the poor. Most of the people we found dead in their homes were by themselves. It speaks to a point that during and after a disaster, that vulnerable population, just like we saw in Sandy, the government has to get there quick. They have to know where they are, and they have to go in and help them, because they will not have the means to have food on hand at home. They will not have a credit card where they can call a hotel and reserve a room at a safe. They probably will not have a car, and many of them don't drive. It's the vulnerable population. Who is the coldest when it's cold? That vulnerable population, elderly, disabled, and poor. I call it Railroad Street. Wall Street, Main Street, that street where people who have a job and get a job. But there's another street in America called Railroad Street. It's where the poor, the disabled, and the elderly live. And ladies and gentlemen, we started a war on poverty, and we fought several since then. We probably could have ended the damn war on poverty, much money as we spent on war in the last 12 years, and do something about this poverty level. which is bred by poor education and over incarceration of poor people. I don't think it's intentional, but it's a consequence of poverty. And until we go after that, we're going to continue to have this problem. And it's going to create more and more social injustice, which leads to environmental injustice. Right now in Louisiana, I know storms are going to come. I know we're going to have floods. My biggest concern in South Louisiana now and in many other parts of the country is when a natural disaster turns into a man-made disaster like we have in Japan right now. And that could happen in many places in America where our youngest nuclear power plant is about 31 years old. How many of you drive a car that's 31 years old? And we haven't found a solution to how we're going to take these things offline and make them safe, because they can destroy an area after they're closed. We've got to come to a conclusion on that. And we can't let industry destroy our water, destroy our air. Right now, we've got certain parts of the state where arsenic is getting to our rice, and it's coming from the extraction business that's been extracting and pouring dirty water back into the aquifer. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got issues with that, and everybody in this room, to include the press, remember, this damn democracy won't work unless the press keep transparency on it.
We're doing our best. That's important stuff. We could do better, a lot better. Governor, let me ask you, building off that, the way natural disasters can become environmental disasters compounded by man-made effects. You know, you look at the last 18 months, I guess you've had 50 fires, you told me, five major ones, one of which my wife's family had their home destroyed, lost everything in the lower North Fork fire. And I wonder, when you're looking at these unprecedented levels of fires and floods, what you think the role that climate change might be playing in this new environment that you've had to deal with?
Well, obviously, I think that's, as soon as you venture onto that ground, you take on certain risks, and it's impossible to say. I do know that a lot of the climate change models 10 years ago were predicting extreme weather events. They looked at places like Colorado as being in rain shadows with more of their precipitation coming as snow rather than water, which is a big deal if half your reservoir capacity is in snowpack. But I think what the key here is not to get tied down in the issue. If you go to Colorado, almost half the people still don't believe that climate change, it may be occurring. They don't think it's the significantly man-made. There are big arguments over it. Hey, most of us don't think our house is going to catch fire. We're going to have an electrical fire and our house burns down. But we spend about 0.5% of what the home is worth every year buying insurance. And I think around climate change, we're well behind that point where we need to be investing in that insurance and looking at what if they're right? If this is climate change and we are getting these extreme weather events, if we are going to have more floods, more droughts, more fires, then what are the things we can do to mitigate that and get out ahead of it so we're not always playing catch up?
But just to follow up, I mean, how we're living in a time of budget constraints all across the board, especially in government. You're always looking for ways to cut, to be more fiscally responsible. That was one of the hallmarks when you were mayor of Denver. But in that environment, how do you budget? How do you budget for the unknown, the unknown unknowns? You know, former mayor of New Orleans used to say, ain't no one ever voted for a Levy. There's not a lot of political popularity in squirreling money away for infrastructure. So how do you deal with that? How do you prepare for it?
Well, first, you do have to have a reserve. When we came in, I got elected in 2012 after that awful recession. But we immediately, even in those first couple of tough budget years, we now have a reserve by the end of this future budget. We're going to have 5.5% of our general fund as a reserve. So hundreds of millions of dollars for this kind of an event. At the same time, when you have a disaster, you've also got to say, as we rebuild, how do we rebuild smarter? In other words, and I think the community is going to demand that we rebuild in such a way we're better off than we were before. That adds real solace to people that have lost so much. To knowledge that we're going to make sure that bridge or the culvert, if it's a culvert, does it have to be bigger? If it's a bridge, is it in the right place? Is it a road? Can we put it higher or lower? You know, what are those decisions? And yet we got to do it real time. Right? We have a quarterback out in Colorado you may have heard of named Peyton Manning, and he does. He
gotta brag about that, don't you?
I'm not bragging if it's true. It's not bragging. He's got this. He's going, hurry, right? And the first 5 games, or the first 4.5 games, he didn't throw an interception, and yet he had about 20 touchdown passes. We're trying to do the same thing in real time, go as fast as we can, but do it better and be careful. And I think that after the fires, how do we make defensible space? People want to live in this kind of what they call the wildland urban interface, where these wildfires can sweep through, especially during a drought. Well, if they're going to be there, how do we make sure that they don't have wood shingle roofs, they don't have a wood deck that comes up to their house, that they clear out some of the trees around them so that we don't subject them and ourselves, because we all pay it through our insurance premiums, but how do we make sure we don't subject them to excessive risk? And that's just putting our shoulder to the wheel and saying, all right, we're going to work harder as we face these realities and try and get out ahead of them.
General, I see you nodding emphatically over there, but let me ask you a real tough question. Do you think that if another Katrina came, God forbid, that New Orleans could meet it head on? Is New Orleans significantly better prepared for another Katrina today, or are they repeating some of the same old mistakes?
Well, as I said, we've invested a lot in our infrastructure. We put a $14 billion levee system that's going to provide better protection. The city of New Orleans now has satellite communications, which they didn't have, as well as the state of Louisiana. The National Guard is one of the best in the nation, as well as a group out in Colorado. The National Guard in Louisiana, when they show up at the flood, they got boats behind the trucks. We're trying to tell the people in New York, when you show up at a flood, bring a boat.
Seems like good advice.
But I do think governments are better prepared, but people, we still got a ways to go, because, again, all data show only about 15% have made that cultural shift that they've got to be prepared, that the best first responder is to be prepared to be your own first responder. And when you take care of yourself, you take care of your neighbor and the rest of your family. And people take that on. That is a responsibility in households. Now, how that get translated in poor communities, in elderly homes, and in people with disabilities is a lot harder, because they're more concerned with the day-to-day survival. So volunteers make a big difference. And it's volunteers that are out there teaching poor kids how to swim. You know, we got less public pools open now than we had 30 years ago. And poor kids are not learning how to swim. We had a scenario in Shreveport about 3 years ago. A family of 15 go out on a Sunday afternoon. A kid flipped into the Red River. When it was over with, 4 people in the family drowned because nobody in that family knew how to swim. Volunteers make a difference. In Katrina, we gave a kid a medal because he had been taught how to swim by Red Cross and by the Boy Scout. Katrina came, he and his mom and his sister in the roof of the house. He remembered what he learned. He heard a boat. They could not break out of the ceiling. Dad was driving a truck in Dallas. He swam out of the house, got the boat, flagged them down, went up, got sister, went got mom, went got grandma, saved the whole family. He did that because somebody showed him how to swim. And there is where the volunteers like Rubicon can go into the vulnerable community and make sure kids learn how to swim. It's a damn shame we got people that can't swim and can't read in the poor community. Until we fix those, we're going to have a sustained problem in these vulnerable areas.
William, that's absolutely. Because we forget about that. But William, when you and your team of vets show up in the aftermath of a disaster, I'm wondering, what are the barriers that are thrown up in your way? We all know they're bureaucratic barriers. Some are based on safety. But how do you overcome them, and which ones are just so stupid that you want to talk to a governor or general about fixing them?
Well, I talked to the governor backstage. There were some bureaucratic barriers for us. We talked about Boulder and trying to get a national volunteer organization into Boulder, which was very difficult, and
It's referred to as the People's Republic of Boulder in Colorado.
May have had something to do with it, yeah.
So bureaucracy is always a problem. It was a problem during our first mission in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, after the earthquake. You know, at that time, there was the media, and it was sensationalist journalism that was actually a problem, because they had this narrative loop that it was too dangerous, don't go, armed mobs, looting, etc. But it was the intelligence that we derived from our sources down in Port-au-Prince that was telling the opposite story. And those were the Jesuits. I have a Jesuit education, and I plugged myself into the Jesuits that were there in Port-au-Prince. And they said, you need to get here now. And so we did, and we ended up very far ahead of the traditional conventional aid organizations. Well, Port-au-Prince showed us the need for improved disaster response in the developing world, but I think Sandy has shown us that we need to improve it here as well. And in that case, we take our direction oftentimes from the Emergency Operations Command. There's always one that's set up. And it was taking too long for us to get that direction during Sandy, and so we sent out our own recce elements, our own reconnaissance elements into the Rockaways, into Brick, New Jersey, and they came back and they said, you guys need to get here now. And so we didn't stop and ask for it, permission. We just went and we did it. And so it's that decisiveness, I think, that veterans bring to the table that's really important. That's going to help ultimately revolutionize disaster response.
Oh, you're doing a lot, and we thank you for it. We've got just a couple more minutes, but real quickly, Governor, I want to ask you, floods aside, fires we see devastate the West. To some extent, the Northeast is isolated from it. Can that be mitigated in the same way that you can prepare for floods with infrastructures?
You can mitigate somewhat, and you can prepare, but it's difficult, and especially at the level of drought is what drives this. And there's a long history with the Forest Service that they, have not let natural forest fires burn. So there's a density of underbrush, especially along close to urban areas, that that does put more people at risk. We're talking now with the western states, putting together all the states and having our own a force of planes, tankers. So, the big key with a forest fire is you got to get there in the first couple hours. So you want to be able to have assets, as my military friends refer to them, assets close at hand and empowered to go immediately when there's a report of fire, to get to it in the first hour or two. Once these fires are 24 hours old with a stiff breeze and dry fuel, Katie barred the door. Your options become severely limited.
Final question for you all, and it really comes down to the heart of this, because we see in disaster after disaster, it comes down to leadership. That's why, General, you were brought in and brought some calm to that situation. When you're in a position of having to make a tough call, a tough decision, in that fog of war, of a crisis situation, what's the lessons you've learned about how to make the right call in those moments?
Be prepared to break the rules. The rules were written for peacetime. Saturday morning, we're evacuating people out of New Orleans airport. I get a call from the TSA guy that they don't have enough stuff. They can't clear all the people. We did a conference call, put him on the speakerphone, reminded him, Osama bin Laden was not in New Orleans. You're looking for terrorists in all the wrong place, buddy. Because we apply the rules, and the rules will stop a recovery in their tracks. You've got to look at what rules we're going to. 2 hours later, we get another call. Pilots fly in with the second group of plane. One of them probably slept in a 4-star hotel the night before, walked in and said, I've talked to all the pilots, and he tell my colonel, we need to have a manifest. Okay, get him on the speakerphone. Get him on the speakerphone. Look, buddy, we cannot create a manifest. Where in the hell am I going to get a manifest from? Most of these people don't have identification. Look, we got guns, you don't. Fly the damn planes. Let's get these people out of here. You got to be prepared to break the rules.
William, that's tough to top, but what lessons have you learned about the tough call in the fog of war?
I just want to break the rules. Yes, and we have done that in the past, and we did it in Haiti, and I just want to support actually what you say, because it's very true. We had in Haiti, there was a lot of aid that was being piled up on the airfield, and it wasn't getting off the airfield and to the people. And when we flew about 2.5 tons of medical supplies in, I remember trying to ask an Army major to help me out to get these medical supplies to our base of operations at the Jesuit Novitiate, and she tried to then take our medical supplies from us. And I said, hell the F no, you're not taking our medical supplies, these are ours. So we had to break the rules. We found our own way. We hired some local nationals, and we slowly got those medical supplies off the airfield under their nose without them knowing about it, and then we went on to save lives doing it. So it's very important.
Governor, you can't say break the rules. What have you learned as governor? You set the rules.
Break every rule you can. No, I'm just kidding. Certainly, you've got to empower your team. So the head of your transportation department, head of your emergency management, your head of your National Guard. The military. It is true. I think what William and the general represent is, if you had military training, you've been in battle, you understand chaos. You understand that there's not enough time to make all these decisions, and yet you've got to go. You got to go. You can't wait. So when I said don't worry about making mistakes, I will back you 100%, and you got to make sure you have good people in place. But we have that, and I think I'm sure the general did as well. Once that's happening, it's real time, and it's got to happen as fast as humanly possible, maybe even faster. And when people do make mistakes, back them up, push it on, keep moving. You got to keep moving.
Press. Make sure you do more than one source. We almost ended up with a problem in New Orleans because 24-hour news cycle, reporters on the street, 15 people just got raped at the Superdome. Didn't go do the footwork to make sure it happened or see somebody. Next thing you know, that's on national news. We almost end up with the Insurrection Act being applied in New Orleans because a police officer said there were snipers. And we almost ended up with the wrong decision being made because the press didn't do their homework. The press got to do their homework. You can't go with what you see. You got to go investigate that. You can't go definitely with what you hear.
We learn it again and again. Thank you all very much. Break the rules. Hurry, hurry, hurry. But be smart. If it was easy, it would have been done. I mean, to a large extent, natural disasters and terrorist attacks are the chief challenges of our time. And that's those moments when they occur, that's when leadership matters. And that's what the gentlemen on stage here today really have epitomized. Beginning with Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper, who's had a biblical onslaught of floods and fires over the last 18 months. Thank you for joining us, sir. William McNulty, former Marine and co-founder and vice president of Team Rubicon, which is a group that sends vets into harm's way to help clean up after disasters. And General Honoré, who
got the National Guard and active military service from Fort Carson working day and night to get these roads open, get people into shelter. It's been pretty inspiring just how hard people have put themselves to it.
And it's still ongoing, of course.
Oh, no, we've got a long way to go.
And William, you know, Team Rubicon has been there in Colorado trying to help the recovery. It's the essence of the first responders. You go, you know, you run towards the fire, you run towards the flood. Tell us what you're doing in Colorado with Team Rubicon right now.
So right now in Colorado, Team Rubicon is doing mucking and gutting operations. So there's many homes that were not in the floodplain. It's just when the flash flood came down.
Those first days we flew over the canyons and down over the Platte River, and we saw all the destruction of roads, and not just the asphalt, but the whole road bed completely gone, bridges broken. And yet when we get on the ground, we'd see people coming together and trying to help each other. And maybe the roads and bridges were broken, but the spirits were unbroken. And it really was a sense that it gave momentum. And we opened a road a couple days ago up what's called Boulder Canyon, out of Boulder, that people thought would take weeks longer to get open. And we've got, you know, our Department of Transportation and Army Corps of Engineers.
The mountains. It happened to hit the homes on the way down. And so these people don't have insurance. And if they're going to pay a for-profit company that's up to $20,000, that they're going to have to come out of their pocket. We do it for free. So we go into those basements, we get dirty, we take all that muck and gut out of those basements and bring some semblance of order back to these people's lives.
And tell me, why, in your estimation, do veterans make the best disaster relief?
Well, it's really interesting because, you know, a lot of things that we see in disaster zones are actually very similar to what we saw in combat zones. And, you know, unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells.
The whole nation knew after Katrina as the man who came in and helped restore order in a chaotic situation. It's an honor to have you all here. Now, Governor, let's begin with you, just to give us an update on the status of those devastating floods in your state, which I understand it's almost $500 million worth of damage at this point on infrastructure, and the human cost even more.
Well, I think we're well over $1 billion if you put the roads in with the housing. And to my knowledge, the first time the National Weather Service ever used the phrase biblical rains. I think the remarkable thing, and when we